This is my ranking of modern JRPGs that I've played based purely on my personal experience. Each one is placed from masterpiece down to trash, depending on how strong the story and characters are, how engaging the turn-based or action combat feels, and how well the progression and world design keep things interesting throughout the journey. Let's get straight into the list. Granblue Fantasy Relink caught my attention right away because of how quickly everything moved without wasting time on unnecessary padding. I liked how the story stayed simple while still giving enough emotional moments to care about the crew and their journey. The combat kept getting better the more characters I unlocked because every fighter felt different instead of sharing the same style with minor changes. I spent a lot of time trying new party setups and chaining abilities together during bigger boss fights. Some side content felt repetitive after a while, and I wish a few character scenes had more depth instead of short conversations. Still, the smooth action, colorful world, and strong boss encounters made it easy to stay invested all the way into the post-game grind. This easily earns a place in my excellent tier. Final Fantasy VII Remake felt like a completely new experience, even though I already knew many of the story moments before going in. I liked how much extra time the game gave to Midgar and its characters because even smaller scenes added personality to the world around them. The combat kept me hooked since switching between party members during fights made every battle feel active and strategic at the same time. Boss encounters looked huge and cinematic without losing the challenge that kept me focused. I did get tired of certain side missions because a few of them slowed the pacing and felt unnecessary compared to the stronger story sections. Still, the soundtrack, emotional moments, and satisfying combat loop stayed with me long after the credits finished rolling. This easily stands among my masterpiece tier picks. Unicorn Overlord kept me invested because every battle felt like I was solving a different strategy puzzle instead of repeating the same tactics again and again. I spent a lot of time adjusting squads, changing unit positions, and testing new combinations just to see how different setups worked during larger fights. The world had much more personality than I expected since many side characters received enough attention to feel important to the journey. I also liked the visual style because every location and character looked detailed without losing that classic fantasy feeling. Some Bond conversations felt unnecessary after a while, and managing such a huge army occasionally became exhausting. Even with that, the tactical depth, strong presentation, and constant variety made it hard to stop playing once I got deeper into the campaign. This easily finds a spot in my excellent tier. Trials of Mana gave me that classic JRPG feeling almost immediately, with its colorful world, simple adventure setup, and fast action combat. I liked how easy it was to switch between party members during fights because it made battles feel more active than many older RPGs I played before it. The class system also kept things interesting since trying different upgrades changed how characters played later in the story. Some dialogue and story moments definitely felt outdated, and there were times when the camera during combat became annoying to manage in crowded fights. Even with those issues, the charm of the world, strong soundtrack, and satisfying boss battles kept the experience fun through most of the journey. It may not reinvent the genre, however, it still gave me a memorable adventure worthy of my great tier. Super Mario RPG stayed fun through nearly the entire adventure because it never took itself too seriously and kept throwing weird ideas at me non-stop. I liked how fast the combat moved while making timing attacks important enough to keep battles engaging. The boss fights were the biggest highlight since many of them added unique mechanics that changed how I approached encounters. I also enjoyed seeing classic Mario characters used in strange and funny situations because it gave the adventure much more personality than I expected. The RPG systems were pretty simple, and normal fights became very easy later in the game, so progression occasionally lacked depth. The charm, soundtrack, humor, and constant variety made the experience difficult to stop playing once things really opened up. This easily deserves a place in my great tier. Sakura Wars gave me something very different from most JRPGs. I usually played because it mixed relationship building, visual novel storytelling, and mech combat into one strange package. I enjoyed spending time with the cast since each character had enough personality to make conversations entertaining throughout the story. The setting also stood out because the steampunk version of Tokyo gave the game a unique atmosphere that stayed memorable long after I finished it. The combat, though, never reached the same level as the story sections because many fights became too simple and lacked challenge after a few hours. I also noticed some predictable plot twists, but the dramatic presentation and character moments kept the adventure entertaining the entire way through. The combination of charm, humor, and anime-style storytelling easily places this game into my good tier. Star Ocean, the second story R, gave me plenty of reasons to stay invested because the fast combat, side activities, and character interactions stayed entertaining through most of the adventure. I liked how chaotic battles became once more abilities and party combinations started opening up later in the game. The private actions were also a huge reason I enjoyed the journey, since many of them added funny or emotional moments that made the cast much more memorable. The story became messy in certain parts, especially near the end, but the adventure remained entertaining because of how much personality the world and characters had. I also spent way too much time messing around with crafting systems and optional activities instead of focusing on the main objective. New distractions kept appearing during exploration and progression. This easily reaches my excellent tier. Monster Hunter Stories 2 Wings of Ruin became hard to stop playing once I started collecting more monsters and experimenting with different team setups. I liked how the combat mixed simple turn-based mechanics with enough strategy to make tougher fights more engaging later in the adventure. Building monsties and transferring abilities between them took most of my attention, because I kept chasing stronger combinations instead of progressing the story. Exploring the world stayed fun since new creatures, quests, and hidden dens regularly gave me more things to discover. Some regular battles started dragging on after a while, especially during longer exploration sections, and the story followed a familiar JRPG structure most of the time. The monster collecting systems and satisfying progression loop carried the experience from beginning to end. This game easily earns its place in my excellent tier. Metaphor ReFantazio caught my interest almost immediately because it combined political drama, social systems, and turn-based combat into something that stayed engaging for dozens of hours. I liked how every major system connected back into the story instead of feeling separated from the world around it. The archetype system gave battles a huge amount of flexibility, and I spent a lot of time experimenting with different party setups for tougher encounters. The cast was another major reason I stayed invested, since each character added something meaningful to the journey and its themes. A few dungeons became repetitive after long sessions, and certain story points repeated ideas more than necessary. The combination of strong writing, satisfying combat progression, and memorable character moments made this adventure difficult to stop thinking about after finishing it. This easily stands among my masterpiece tier selections. Expedition 33 became one of those RPGs where I kept wanting to move forward just to see the next major story moment or boss fight. I liked how the combat mixed turn-based systems with timed dodges and parries because it made encounters feel much more active than usual. Each party member also played differently enough that changing team setups actually mattered during tougher fights. The story carried a heavy tone for most of the adventure. Still, the character interactions and smaller camp moments helped balance things nicely. Some late story developments moved a little too quickly. A few dungeon paths became confusing during longer sessions. The emotional storytelling, satisfying combat depth, and memorable cast stayed with me long after the credits rolled. This easily secures its place in my excellent tier. Ys 9 Monstrum Nox became much more fun once the movement abilities started opening up the city and letting me travel across rooftops and walls at high speed. I liked how fast the combat moved because fights rarely slowed down, especially during larger enemy encounters later in the story. Exploration also stayed entertaining since every new ability made revisiting older areas more rewarding. Some combat sections lacked challenge on normal difficulty, and a few environments outside the city looked plain compared to stronger locations. I ended up enjoying the cast more than expected, especially during side quests that gave extra attention to the characters and the problems happening around Balduq. The movement systems, fast pacing, and satisfying action combat made the adventure consistently entertaining across its entire runtime. This easily earns a place in my great tier. Stranger of Paradise. Final Fantasy Origin took a while before the story started connecting, but I stayed interested because the combat kept introducing new ways to approach battles. I spent a lot of time experimenting with different jobs since changing classes, completely changed how tougher encounters played out. Some bosses became intense once enemy attacks demanded better timing and build setups. The characters and dialogue were messy for a large part of the adventure, and several emotional scenes lacked the impact the game clearly wanted them to have. Managing equipment also became frustrating because missions constantly dropped huge amounts of gear after every battle. The fast action combat and satisfying class customization carried most of the experience, while the Final Fantasy references added extra fun through exploration. This finally earns a place in my good tier. Tales of Arise gave me the kind of modern action JRPG experience I wanted with its fast combat, strong party chemistry, and smooth progression systems. The combat stayed exciting because every character brought different abilities that changed how battles flowed during tougher encounters. I spent a lot of time experimenting with party setups and chaining attacks together just to see how stylish fights could become later in the game. The story handled heavier themes better than expected, and the relationship between the main cast slowly became one of the strongest parts of the adventure. Some dialogue sections dragged on too long, and a few late story reveals felt weaker compared to earlier sections. The satisfying combat loop and memorable cast made this adventure easy to stay invested in across dozens of hours. This easily belongs in my excellent tier. Visions of Mana gave me a fun mix of fast action combat, colorful exploration, and class customization that stayed entertaining through most of the adventure. The class system became the biggest reason I stayed invested because changing elemental roles completely changed how each character played during battles. I spent a lot of time testing different builds and abilities just to handle tougher bosses more efficiently. The cast also grew on me more as the story progressed since several characters received stronger development than I expected early on. The pacing became much slower later in the game, and certain story sections dragged longer than necessary once the adventure reached its final stretch. The combat variety, memorable party members, and satisfying progression systems made the journey consistently enjoyable across dozens of hours. This easily settles into my great tier. Final Fantasy VII Rebirth became one of the most memorable JRPG adventures I've played in years because almost every part of the game felt packed with something meaningful to do. The combat became even better than Remake once the new party mechanics and character abilities started opening up during tougher battles. I spent hours exploring optional regions, playing side activities, and experimenting with different builds instead of rushing through the main story. The cast remained the strongest part of the experience since nearly every major character received moments that added more emotional weight to the journey. Some open-world activities became repetitive after a while, and the ending introduced story ideas that felt more confusing than emotional. The scale, combat depth, world exploration, and character moments made this adventure incredibly difficult to forget. This easily rises into my masterpiece tier. Chained Echoes was one of the easiest RPGs to stay invested in because it constantly introduced new mechanics, characters, and side content without wasting time on unnecessary grinding. The combat stayed engaging, since the overdrive system pushed me to think carefully instead of repeating the same attacks every battle. I also enjoyed how flexible the party building was once more characters and abilities started unlocking later in the adventure. The story managed to balance political conflicts, emotional moments, and larger twists better than I expected from an indie RPG. Some dialogue sections were weaker than others, and a few humor attempts did not always land perfectly during serious scenes. The smart combat systems, memorable cast, and consistently rewarding progression made this adventure difficult to stop thinking about afterward. This easily secures a place in my masterpiece tier. Triangle strategy kept me invested because the political conflicts and major decisions actually felt important instead of existing only to create fake choices. The voting system added tension since I constantly had to convince party members to support the direction I wanted the story to take. Battles stayed engaging because positioning and map mechanics mattered during nearly every difficult encounter. I spent a lot of time thinking carefully about unit placement and attack timing instead of rushing through fights carelessly. Some story scenes dragged on too long, especially during chapters packed with heavy dialogue before battles finally started. Certain character motivations also became predictable once the morality system was easier to understand. The strong tactical combat, memorable decision-making, and engaging war drama made this strategy RPG difficult to stop playing. This easily earns a place in my excellent tier. Octopath Traveler II stayed engaging for dozens of hours because every character story brought a different tone, personality, and motivation to the adventure. The combat remained extremely satisfying since breaking enemy defenses and setting up stronger attacks always made battles feel strategic without becoming overly complicated. I spent a lot of time experimenting with party setups and secondary jobs just to handle tougher bosses more effectively. Some story chapters were stronger than others, and a few sections required more grinding than I wanted before progressing further. The world also stayed interesting to explore, because towns, side paths, and hidden abilities constantly rewarded curiosity during travel. The turn-based combat, memorable cast, emotional story moments, and rewarding progression systems made this adventure incredibly hard to stop playing. This easily stands tall within my masterpiece tier. Xenoblade Chronicles 3 remained interesting for an absurd number of hours because the story, world, and character relationships kept evolving in meaningful ways. The main cast ended up being the strongest part of the experience since every character received enough development to feel important throughout the journey. Combat also became far deeper than I expected, once more classes, abilities, and party combinations started unlocking later in the game. I spent a huge amount of time experimenting with different team setups instead of rushing through the main objective. Some tutorials lasted too long during the opening hours, and a few side quest systems became annoying because important information was not always easy to track down. The emotional storytelling, massive world design, and rewarding combat systems made this adventure incredibly hard to put down. This easily earns its place in my masterpiece tier. Rune Factory Guardians of Azuma had enough charm and relaxing systems to keep me playing because the characters and village management were more enjoyable than the actual combat. Building villages and unlocking upgrades gave me a nice sense of progression during the earlier parts of the adventure. I also ended up liking several party members more than expected since the social interactions added personality to the world. The combat became repetitive pretty quickly because most battles relied on basic attacks and simple elemental weaknesses without much depth. Dungeon design also started feeling repetitive since many areas reused similar layouts and puzzle ideas too often. I spent more time focusing on relationships, exploration, and customization systems instead of looking forward to major fights. The relaxing atmosphere and likable cast placed this game into my good tier. Fire Emblem Engage stood out because the tactical combat constantly encouraged smarter positioning, better timing, and more creative team setups during difficult battles. The Emblem system added a huge amount of flexibility since different ring combinations could completely change how characters performed in combat. I spent a lot of time experimenting with classes and unit pairings instead of rushing through the story missions. Battles remained exciting because enemy encounters regularly pushed different mechanics and strategies into focus. The story lacked the same level of depth as the gameplay because many characters relied too heavily on repeated personality traits during support conversations. Some activities around the hub area also slowed the pacing more than necessary and added systems that were easy to ignore entirely. The strong strategy mechanics and satisfying combat depth easily place this game into my excellent tier. Trails in the Sky. First chapter delivered some of the strongest world building and character writing I've seen in a JRPG, because the adventure constantly felt personal and meaningful instead of relying only on dramatic moments. The story moved at a slower pace compared to many modern RPGs, but that approach gave the cast and locations far more depth over time. I spent a lot of time talking to NPCs and completing side quests because the world kept changing in believable ways after major events. Combat also stayed satisfying thanks to the timeline system and flexible orbment customization that rewarded smarter planning during harder encounters. Some early sections moved a little too slowly, and a few repeated battle themes started becoming noticeable during longer sessions. The emotional storytelling, memorable cast, and rewarding combat systems easily make this adventure part of my masterpiece tier. Persona 3 Reload carried a heavy atmosphere through nearly the entire adventure, and that tone made the story hit much harder once the bigger emotional moments started unfolding. The mix of school life, dungeon exploration, and relationship building created a satisfying rhythm that rarely became boring across long play sessions. I spent a lot of time managing social links, fusing personas, and preparing stronger party setups before returning to Tartarus. The updated combat systems also made battles flow much better because fights moved faster while keeping the original mechanics intact. Tartarus could become repetitive after long grinding sessions since many floors eventually started looking too similar. Some slower story sections also took time before major plot developments finally started happening. The darker themes, strong cast chemistry, and rewarding progression systems placed this adventure inside my masterpiece tier. The DioField Chronicle had a few interesting ideas with its real-time strategy combat, but the rest of the experience never reached the same level. Battles moved at a fast pace, and combining different abilities during larger encounters could sometimes create genuinely satisfying moments. I spent more time experimenting with party setups and skill combinations than paying attention to the actual story. The combat system also encouraged smarter positioning, since attacking enemies from different angles made fights far more manageable. The biggest problem came from the controls, because selecting characters and managing actions during hectic battles often felt awkward and frustrating. The story and world leaned too heavily on familiar fantasy ideas without giving the cast enough personality to stand out properly. The decent combat mechanics could not fully carry the repetitive narrative and frustrating controls, placing this game into my mediocre tier. Scarlet Nexus mixed fast action combat with heavy anime-style storytelling in a way that stayed entertaining much longer than I expected. The combat system worked especially well because switching between psychokinesis attacks, weapon combos, and party abilities made battles feel extremely active during tougher encounters. I spent a lot of time experimenting with different SAS abilities and character combinations just to see how fights could change against stronger enemies. The dual protagonist structure also made the story more interesting, since both campaigns revealed different sides of the same major events. Enemy variety became repetitive after a while, and several areas started blending together because too many locations reused similar designs and layouts. The stylish combat flow, strong character interactions, and satisfying progression systems easily secured this adventure a spot in my great tier. That's how these modern JRPGs stack up for me after playing through them. Some stand out with strong combat, characters, and progression systems, while others lean more on individual strengths like story or gameplay, but each one brings its own take on the JRPG experience. Thanks for watching.